Hi, I'm Valerie, and this is my reading wrap-up, roundup, how I describe the books that I read for the month of July. It is July. Yeah, July of 2020. Time has no meaning. So for July, I read 3.5-ish books, and I'll describe sort of the circumstances of those as we go along. I read So You Want to Talk About Race by Ileoma Oluo. I read The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. I read Rest in Pieces, The Curious Fates of Famous Corpses by Bess Lovejoy. And I read or listened to some of The Sweetness at the Bottom of the Pie by Alan Bradley. So, in turn, book one. So You Want to Talk About Race by Ileoma Oluo. And I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I just listened to a YouTube video on how to pronounce it, so hopefully that's correct. Because of the social circumstances, cultural circumstances that we're living in, I really feel like it's incumbent upon me to do a better job of educating myself with regard to Black and concerns for people of color, which should be concerns for everyone, but Black Lives Matter clearly makes it clear that it has not been. So, as a white woman, I feel somewhat anxious discussing these topics, honestly, for fear of saying the wrong thing, of airing my ignorance and in some way hurting or offending Black people or people of color. I also feel like right now is my time as a white person to shut up and to listen and learn. However, I feel like personally, part of my processing and understanding my complicity or my part in the culture that we live in is sort of educating myself and then talking through it. So if I can help anyone else come to understand a little bit more some of these issues, I want to do that. So I'd recommend this book to anyone who's trying to better understand how to have hard conversations and learn more about racism and sort of intersectionality and how that impacts all of us, but in particular underrepresented communities. And I think part of that first, and it's very uncomfortable, is to challenge and acknowledge your own complicity in a culture of white supremacy. To acknowledge where someone else's disadvantage may have been to your advantage. I need to acknowledge that my race has allowed me to be seen more as an individual than someone of color who may be seen as representative of their entire race and seen less as an individual and given less opportunities as a result of that. This book gave practical advice, such as scripting suggestions for combating microaggressions if you witness them, sort of on the path to allyship, to show support for the subject of such aggressions, naming the slight, asking someone why they'd say that, making them acknowledge plainly what they're saying. It encourages allies to be sure that they're going to offer support, that they're not going to put the subject at risk. It also talks about giving the floor in whatever arena you're able to do so to people of color. I feel like this book was helpful personally with definition of terms that I thought I understood, but not completely for sure, and assured me that the onus is on me to educate myself further and find ways that I can create space and room in whatever facet I am able to, in whatever way I can help level the playing field, so to speak, understanding that I cannot make up for hundreds of years of oppression and sort of a head start for the white race, but I can try to advocate wherever possible, in whatever realm possible, for representation and a place at the table. Offer, a foot up, a leg up, whatever I can, wherever I am. I found this book to be really impactful. I listened to it in the audiobook format that was read by the author, and hearing it in her own words, I think, was really powerful. So, as a change of pace, the second book that I read this month was Sweetness at the Bottom of the Pie, which is the first Flavia de Luce book by Alan Bradley. And this I also listened to in the audiobook format. The voice actor who was reading it was very enjoyable. British, youngish sounding female. The story essentially is of young Flavia de Luce. She's, I believe, 11 or 12. She lives in Britain, and she's a prodigy and very precocious. She's an aspiring chemist in the 50s. She's a younger sister, and she's sort of experimenting on her siblings and enjoying what was a once great mansion, which is her home, called Buckshaw, when she's thrust into a mystery. A dead bird shows up on the doorstep of her home with a rare stamp on it, and then a dead body is discovered in her garden. And then her jiggling fanny pack ended the adventure and returned her audiobook to the library ahead of schedule, putting her back at the end of the long waiting list. No, wait, that wasn't Flavia, that was me. To be continued. The next book that I read this month was another serious topic. It was The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Era of Color Blindness by Michelle Alexander. And I'll just lead with that this is an incredibly well-researched, again, very topical book. It also was, by its nature, it was challenging subject material, certainly. I want to quote the author to kind of give a summation of the book. In the era of color blindness, it is no longer socially permissible to use race explicitly as a justification for discrimination, exclusion, and social contempt. So we don't. Rather than rely on race, we use our criminal justice system to label people of color criminals and then engage in all the practices we supposedly left behind. Today, it is perfectly legal to discriminate against criminals in nearly all the ways that it was once legal to discriminate against African Americans. Once you're labeled a felon, the old forms of discrimination, employment discrimination, housing discrimination, denial of the right to vote, denial of educational opportunity, denial of food stamps and other public benefits, and exclusion from jury service are suddenly legal. As a criminal, you have scarcely more rights and arguably less respect than a black man living in Alabama at the height of Jim Crow. We have not ended racial caste in America. We have merely redesigned it. Michelle Alexander kind of starts the book with her introduction saying who the book is for, that it's for people who want to understand better or be able to make factual and reasoned arguments to their neighbors about these issues. And I think she accomplishes it really admirably. It's the scope of this. The book is incredibly well researched. The statistics in it are really eye-opening. It's presented really well. The focus is on Black men, and the introduction kind of talks about some of the critique that she has received, that it is not more inclusive in terms of talking about females of color or different other minority groups that may be experiencing some of the similar repercussions. But she talks through why she chose to focus on Black men primarily in this book. So even if you're familiar with sort of, the problematic nature of the Reagan era initial, war on drugs, this really sort of traces the roots and sort of the whole breadth of, the collusion that the various branches of the criminal justice system and the phasic nature of sort of the school to prison pipeline, in really just the scope of it is really, I feel inarticulate in comparison to it. Another quote from the book that I think goes on to illustrate the genius of the current caste system and what most distinguishes it from its predecessors is that it appears voluntary. People choose to commit crimes, and that's why they're locked up or locked out, we're told. This feature makes the politics of responsibility particularly tempting, as it appears the system can be avoided with good behavior. But herein lies the trap. All people make mistakes. All of us are sinners. All of us are criminals. All of us violate the law at some point in our lives. In fact, if the worst thing you have ever done is speed 10 miles over the speed limit on the freeway, you have put yourself and others at more risk of harm than someone smoking marijuana in the privacy of his or her living room. Yet there are people in the United States serving life sentences for first-time drug offenses, something virtually unheard of anywhere else in the world. The long and the short of it is, read this book. Read this book. The final book that I completed this month is Rest in Pieces, The Curious Fates of Famous Corpses by Bess, Lovejoy. And though that doesn't sound like a topic that would be a lighthearted break from some of the more serious subject matter that I was attempting to read and process this month, it was. This was a very enjoyable book. It was not my choice for book club, but it was my book club that I belong to, the book that we were reading this month. And there were tons of just interesting sort of factoids, and I'll mention some of them. It's about the fates of famous corpses, but it's also was sort of chock-a-block full of interesting terminology. Some of the kind of cool things, and I did a little research. I would make a note, and then I went on to research some of these topics. And by research, I mean giving it a Google. Death masks from the Middle Ages to the 19th century used to serve as models for sculptors to create statues and busts of the dead. In the 1800s, they became valued for themselves, a la Wikipedia. A cenotaph was a term that I came across, and that is a monument to someone buried elsewhere. You may have heard the term rigor mortis before, the stiffness. It's Latin. It refers to the rigidity. Literal translation is the stiffness of death. There is also algor mortis, which is the coldness of death, and livor mortis, which is the blueness of death. Let's see. As far as interesting corpses, we have Saint Nicholas, who died in the first half of the 4th century AD. There is a Saint Nicholas Center even today. What's interesting about Saint Nicholas, or what I found interesting that was noted, is that his bones are noted to secrete a liquid called manna or myrrh, which is said to smell like roses and possess potent healing powers. So I did a little research on this one, and according to the stnicholascenter.org, in 1087, the archbishop opened the sarcophagus and extracted 1 to 2 glasses of water, which he dilutes with holy water. In 1954, the bones were put on continuous display and are seen visibly to sweat. Again, they're sweating this myrrh. And then from 1980 onward, the manna is extracted every May 9th. And it's said to be a much smaller amount at this point. But ew. In World War II, there was a ditty, and this little tidbit came from the story about Hitler's corpse, and remarked upon the fact that Hitler is said to only have had 1 testicle. So the ditty is Land of Soap and Water, and there is a recording of this by the U.S. Navy band. Hitler's having a bath. Churchill's looking through the keyhole, having a jolly good laugh. Hitler has only got 1 ball. Goring's are so very small. Himmler's so very similar. And Goebel has no balls at all. So just random silliness. Another interesting tidbit, if you've ever heard the expression tapping the admiral, it's related to preserving a corpse in alcohol. So on long ship voyages, sometimes corpses, I guess, were placed in barrels of alcohol. So Lord Horatio Nelson was so pickled after dying in the Battle of Trafalgar, and supposedly sailors began siphoning some of said alcohol off on the way home, and they referred to that as tapping the admiral. I'm interested in knowing more about the Monuments Men, who were a group of Allied museum curators, artists, and art historians who volunteered to preserve cultural treasures threatened by the war. And apparently there's a good book by the same name that I'm going to look into. In the spirit of sort of the Black Lives Matter and equality and inclusion that I've been researching of late, Dorothy Parker apparently willed her estate to Martin Luther King, and eventually her cremated ashes were memorialized by the NAACP, which I thought was really interesting, as well as the plaque that she had requested, which says, "Excuse my dust." This information comes from the library.leeds.ac.uk. Graves were dug, and whoever arrived for a burial, so whoever passed away, I guess, during that time, was interred irrespective of age or sex. A common grave was a plot which belonged to the owners of the cemetery rather than a private individual, and was used for people who didn't have the means to pay for a plot with private burial rights. They generally were not marked with a headstone. And of those, there was a type called a lockup. This was the cheapest type of common grave. Plots were not backfilled, but sealed with locking wooden doors until they were full. And usage of those stopped around 1890. A public grave, in contrast, has a headstone with all the occupants detailed. Apparently, Jesus's foreskin is thought to exist as a holy relic, and it is called the Holy Prepuce. I learned about Jeremy Bentham, who was the founder of utilitarianism, which says the best way to make decisions is to figure out what will cause the most happiness for the greatest number of people. So Jeremy Bentham lived from 1748 to 1832 in England. He was a proponent of animal rights, women's rights, science, and progress, as well as dissection. He came up with the concept of an auto icon, or further uses of the dead to the living. So he argued that corpses should be preserved for the use and enjoyment of future generations. For example, to adorn homes and gardens and to be used as stage props. He created 11 categories for the use of corpses, and his head was moved into storage during World War II to protect it from bombs. Interesting. And the last one I'll mention was Timothy Leary, because Timothy Leary, I think most people know him as for his work with LSD. Interestingly, his values were autonomy, personal growth, creativity, and wild experimentation. And a quote that I wrote down for him is, "You've got to approach dying the way you live your life, with curiosity, hope, experimentation, and with the help of your friends." And so with that, I will end it. Have you read any of the books that were in my wrap up for the month? If so, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are. Feel free to link to your Goodreads if you're a Goodreads reviewer. If you have any other recommendations, I'd love to hear them too. Thanks for watching.